ascendant? Why is it so important? And why does it matter? If you're brand new to astrology, or maybe even been looking at some other content about astrology and you're brand new to the subject or fairly new to the subject, maybe you want a better understanding of what the ascendant is. It is the rising sign. That's another thing, that a way to language what the ascendant is. But I'm going to cover some very basic pieces of information about what it is, the mechanics, a little bit of the mechanics, not a lot, and just kind of get you started off on a very foundational basic. And hopefully at the end of this video, you will come to understand a little bit more about the ascendant, why it's so powerful, and what it means about you and for you. So it's kind of the date you were born, the hour and minute you were born, and also the place you were born on this thing we call Earth that's spinning through space. So I hope you enjoy this video, and thank you for joining me. I'm Sarah Christensen with One Sage's View Astrology. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started. In calculating the ascendant, some of the most important pieces of information are what any astrologer is going to ask you if they're going to create a chart for you to do a reading. So those are, what's your birth information, what was your birthday, and what's your birth time, and where were you born. These are the pieces of information that any astrologer will ask to determine how to enter the data into a software program nowadays to help us calculate the chart. Some people don't know their time of birth, and of course that's going to affect any astrologer's ability to create a chart that is accurate. Now, some even recorded birth times might be on the quarter hour or the half hour, and so they might have a little bit of discrepancy, and there's a process called rectification to try to narrow that down. But when you have a pretty close time, that could be done. But also, many births nowadays are recorded with a time, and I don't know how far it goes back. I know that recently I tried to get the birth time for my grandfather, who was born in 1918, and they didn't record that kind of information at that time. So a rectification is involved, or looking for some kind of family history that might have recorded it in someone's Bible or journal. So those are kind of some things that we look for as an astrologer to be able to build an accurate time of birth, because that time of birth is going to essentially set up the ascendant, which will be a part of the chart on the eastern horizon where the sun is rising. We look for that, what was rising in the heavens, basically, in terms of the calculation. Now, evolutionary astrology uses a tropical zodiac and not the sidereal, so that's a very important component here. But I want to just point out the calculation does require that birth time. Okay, so we are going to go into a little bit more detail on that calculation and some components that have, I guess, through history, and I'm going to only cover very simple stuff in terms of historical perspectives. I like to start off with understanding the word horoscope, so you can understand that a little bit just by the simple word. 15 years ago, I didn't even know what my rising sign was. I didn't know what an ascendant was. I had no idea. All I knew is I was a Sagittarius sun. I only knew from sun sign astrology, and sometimes would peek at my astrology in the section of the magazines I would read once in a while. It really wasn't something that I was focused on at all until about 2009, when I was driving with my then boss. She asked me what my rising sign was, and I was like, what are you talking about? All I knew was that I was sun sign Sagittarius. That's all I knew. It was then that conversation kind of lit up the interest of exploring, what is she talking about? And she helped me figure out what time of birth were you? And we entered in my information, and we figured it out that week. I think we were going somewhere to do a presentation for the schools that we work on at. But I learned that I was Aries rising after putting in my information into the software program that we had access to back then. And we figured out a lot of things that matched in our charts. But that was fun to kind of have that curiosity and having the ability to quickly get to the chart information. I didn't have the math to do that. It was only because of software programs that allowed us to quickly assess and figure out what my chart was. So you may have had the same experience when someone maybe first introduced you to astrology, of understanding, oh, I'm more than just a Libra or an Aries or a Scorpio or whatever. You find out that you're more than just your sun sign, that you also have a moon sign. But maybe it was like, what does it mean? What's that rising sign? What's the ascendant? And so that's what this video is about. So I hope you have fun exploring and understanding a little bit more about the Ascendant, and that it will hopefully by the end of this video give you, curb some curiosity for you about what that really is and the complexity of calculating that maybe before we had computers. And that's why astrology is taking off again, is because of the ease of calculations, because some of us were not considered strong in our mathematics in high school or college, and so maybe we chose different professions. But now we have the ease of access in this, but not that it can't be done. Calculation by hand has been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that made it accessible to people who were not daunted by that or had the access to learning that by somebody introducing it to them, because it was not really common in a lot of places. And only in the last, I would say, 30 years or so, maybe 40 years, it's becoming more and more prominent. So I have fun exploring astrology, and I hope you will join me and figure out why the Ascendant is so valuable and what it can tell you about yourself. Let's get started in figuring that out. Let's go. All right, we're going to be discussing some of the details of the importance of the Ascendant, what it is, and some of the mechanics of it, just to kind of get a general nice foundation of the importance of the Ascendant. So I'm glad you could dive in this subject material with me. And if you have questions, please, again, put them down below and I'll try to answer them the best I can based on what your question is. Okay, I want to start with the word horoscope, because I think it is so foundational to understanding the Ascendant, because the diagram, or basically the word and the etymology will kind of give you a decent kind of understanding of it as well. So the word and horoscope is just basically, the definition is a diagram of the relative positions of planets and signs of the zodiac at a specific time at one's birth, for use by astrologers inferring individual character and personality traits and in foretelling events of a person's life. An astrological forecast is also kind of when you cast the chart, it gives you that detail. And the etymology of the word horoscope, I like to look at the background of the word itself. And from Middle English, you have horoscopum, from Latin horoscopus, and from the Greek is horoscopos, from hora and scopos, which is the hour watcher, basically. And I think it's interesting to look at the etymology of a word, because it gives you kind of where, kind of the origin of it. So the origin that we have for this word goes back to the Greek, and then it was moved along through Latin and Old English, and then what we have today from the English and French terms. So how is the Ascendant calculated? This is important, because the first time, when we go back in the beginnings of astrology, back in, I think, 2nd century, 4th century, they were definitely writing about astrology. That's what, when you study Hellenistic astrology, you'll get an understanding of that by what's been translated. But the first calculations before we had clocks and watches and that way of telling time is sundials. And this is the oldest sundial that we know of. I think that's from the Egypt Valley of the Kings. So it was kind of in blocks of time in terms of what they could see in the sundials. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is how it was calculated early on. But then over time, we have the 2nd or 1st century, perhaps, is when the astrolabe come in. The oldest known artifact of an astrolabe that we know of, I think, is from 10th century that I found in my research. But now we have the access with our phones, right? So this makes having access to these calculations, mathematical calculations and position done through software quickly in the palm of our hand now. And so this has really accelerated our ability to not only look at a natal chart, but also transits and other types of astrological calculations. So this is what we have looked at in time. And so let's look at how it's calculated. So here's the long I kind of asked the Google, like, what is the step-by-step calculation? And this is what it kind of gathered for me. I have not personally done calculation by hand. Sometime when I get home and I have extra time, I've purchased the book of tables that you could do that exercise. But if you are just beginning in astrology, you might be just wanting to learn some of the basics before actually creating a chart by hand. But again, you're looking at the gathering the birth data, and that is including the time zone, and also consider time zones are very important, because even when you're calculating with a software program, I had an error early on in astrology when I was doing some readings about when daylight savings time came into effect, and there's different points in time, and I had to go back and redo a whole reading because of an hour change on someone's chart, because the daylight savings time that was in the system was not accurate, and I had to correct it. So it's important to understand daylight savings time because it actually is what we record as the time, and that's what's going to appear. Now, there were absolutely certain things and elements that showed up in the chart that still made sense. But again, having the accurate ascendant time is so important and critical, I think, in the overall accuracy. So if you make a mistake, you go back and you redo it. So this is just a quick kind of understanding of applying a formula for the ascendant, and I'm not going to go into the math. It's calculating the correct eastern horizon out, and that's kind of giving that it falls within a correct quadrant of the 0 degrees to the 360, the circle, right? And then it's determining the ascendant sign. Like I said, thank goodness we have the ability with modern day computers and software to calculate this for us. But you have to maybe look into the programs that you appreciate, maybe the user interface and how you do that and what you're looking at and what other astrologers may be using. But I think from a beginner's astrologer standpoint, I would go with free software until you really wanted to get more if you were doing more professional readings or something. The free astrology is like astro.com and astro/seek.com are excellent, and I highly recommend. They do so many things that I use still to this day. So here's just a real quick list of some of the software: astro.com, astroseek.com. Those are the 2 free ones. There might be some other free ones that I'm not familiar with. I use SolarFire, AstroGold, Sirius. I've heard Janus is really popular. I also have Time Passages, and I don't know if I've looked at CoStar yet, but there's a whole list of astrology software that's out there and accessible. So it depends on what your needs are. And I think if you're in the first year of astrology, unless you're really deciding that you want to study in depth and become super, knowledgeable about things beyond your own astrology. But I think it depends on how deep you want to go, right? Like if you want to go into progressions, and that's a more intermediate study, or things like solar arcs and solar returns and different calculations, maybe a program that's more robust might help you do that. So, but just to list off some that will be helpful. Okay, going into other detail on the horoscope, I want to look at, it's just knowing the details of your time of birth, and a lot of people have that. I don't think everybody has their time of birth, because some weren't recorded. You might have been adopted from another country, and the other country did not have that time. And that's when the trained astrologer, professional astrologer, can do a rectification and feel, very confident with what they do. I highly recommend people who do that all the time, and because there are strong astrologers who offer that as part of their service and in their offerings. So, but for the most part, most of us can go get that information off of our birth certificate. And if we don't have the birth certificate, we have a parent who knows when we were born, or we might have somebody in the family who knows when we were born. But time of birth is just so important about the accuracy of being able to create your chart. So I think that's important to cover. Now, we have the ability to quickly assess the time. Maybe we're present at someone's birth, and so we can see, oh, that's accurate with maybe the nurses who are assisting in the birth are reading out time of birth. I watched my sister have her daughter, and I was amazed at how quickly they called out the time of birth. And what's fascinating is that my little niece has a 29-degree rising sign, so their accuracy accuracy was really important because it would click over in just a few minutes into the next sign. So their accuracy is very important. So this is a little detail on the timing of the ascendant degree and how often it changes on the calculation. So when that Earth is moving and spinning to give us the day, as the sun, as the horizon moves. And when we're looking on the eastern horizon, if you're standing, say, on the beach in Oregon, and you're looking out in the morning, what is rising? Right? When the sun is or before the sun is rising, maybe the sun is below the horizon and then it rises and it moves across the heavens. So it's very important to understand that timing. That timing is basically for every 4 minutes of time, the ascendant degree clicks 1 degree. And so when you add that up over, say, an hour, so 60 minutes, you have 15 degrees of change in degree. So say 0 degrees Cancer becomes 15 degrees Cancer 1 hour later. The ascendant covers one zodiacal sign in 2 hours, and that's how it can cover the whole zodiacal wheel within the 24-hour period. So it's really, kind of the mechanics of how things are calculated, and it's fun to watch a real-time clock with astrology because you can see kind of it clicking, and sometimes you can have that sped up so you can actually kind of see that quickly not have to sit there for 24 hours, but you understand what I'm saying. So it's kind of that calculation, okay, in the given of a 24-hour day. And there's a little spin for you. So it is for every 4 minutes of movement, for every 4 minutes there is a movement of 1 degree on the chart, okay? So if somebody is born at 12 o'clock and it's at 0 degrees of Cancer, and by 4 minutes later, 12:04, it would be 1 degree of Cancer. So you understand the concept? So I think that's very, hopefully, simple in terms of trying to articulate what is happening. And of course, whatever angle of where you are on planet Earth, where you are above the equator is the northern hemisphere, and then below the equator, and then you have the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. And so that's important to understand as well. The degree of the ascendant represents a symbolic mirror, and it is your relationship to the planetary bodies in the heavens at the moment of your birth. So you take your first in-breath as an infant, you're just born, and you've pretty much imprinted the planetary bodies of our solar system within that first breath. And that becomes kind of the still moment of what's imprinted in the consciousness, kind of as the beginning seed of life. And when you put that together, you also have the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus in the Hermetica, and it's basically as above, so below, as within, so without, that whole context. And I will add the link to there's multiple translations of that from the Emerald Tablet. And I think it's a foundational thing that's offered in our understanding of our relationship on Earth and our experiences to the movement of the planetary bodies against the celestial sphere. So I think you can gather your own kind of what works for you in understanding that. But to me, that's like something it's almost like a foundational stone of what we stand upon in our understanding, is from the perspective of being in a body and understanding what we're observing in the heavens. Now, there is another aspect of understanding the heavens. Some of the astrology disciplines, like Vedic astrology, will look at, I think it's a 23.5 degree view of the heavens, so just a slice. And that is using a very specific perception of looking into the heavens. And the Vedic is, a whole discipline within a large body of work that's been done in astrology. So I think that's valuable. And there's also, I think, a lot of Western astrology from the context of the tropical zodiac. And so you might want to become aware of what's sidereal versus tropical. And that's an important foundational thing as well. but I will go into a little bit more detail on that in another slide. But that can affect perceptions of what sits in what house in a chart and how that will be calculated from the software or by hand if they do it by hand. There's also different points of view of what you're looking at when you're looking at some, say, Vedic charts versus Western tropical charts that are the circle. Okay, so I want to point that out because that's kind of in part maybe the basics, because we're looking at, I'm an evolutionary astrologer. I use the tropical and zodiac, and I also use Placidus house for the bulk of my readings. I will work with Hellenistic traditional methodologies that I've learned from Demetra George, Chris Brennan, and others when I find it useful for a perspective that I'm looking at something very specific. Some people prefer to use those whole signs. I prefer to have quadrant houses, and we'll discuss that in the houses video, okay? But I think that's important to point out, okay? What else do I want to cover about the ascendant? Let's look at the power of the ascendant. So the power of the ascendant is that it is the most accurate in terms of the calculation of the birth chart. Some people might come to an astrologer and say, oh, I was born around 12:30 in the afternoon. That is like a signal for an astrologer to like, oh, that's right on like at the half hour. So maybe there's a time, maybe it's 12:28 actually, or maybe it's 12:24 or something like that. So you can see how there's a slight degree difference, and that will change that ascendant time and can indicate a big change when you're looking at big cycles. So the accuracy of the ascendant is so valuable because it truly gives the accuracy for timing of the spiral out of life of future events and improves the ability to predict certain planetary conjunctions, oppositions, squares that are going on that are relative to your own natal chart. So that's important. So it's the accuracy of the overall calculation. The natal chart can, of course, be a tool. Most of us use it as a tool to explore the potentials of our life, like what's going on in my life now. I need to look at it's a valuable tool for looking at some experiences and then looking at the self experience within that. And it helps many people as a guide to understanding themselves in terms of planetary archetypal resonance and how they can understand something about themselves in a situation or a larger situation or an immediate personal situation, because it can do both from what I call the personal and micro perspective, and not only what's going on outside, but also what's going on with you on the internal plane of yourself, your inner world. And because we can sometimes have experiences that are ignited, but we're wrestling with them all within ourselves, and it doesn't necessarily show up in an external perspective of events that are playing out in the outer world. They can be inner landscape kind of movement that's going on for an individual in their psyche and how they might address it. It might end up all in their journals and that might not ever, see the light of day but it's something that the person has gone through and is maybe wrestling with and trying to figure out, or is confronted with maybe a value or a belief or something, and they're figuring it out, but it's not necessarily something that is broadcast, right? And so it's important to understand there are different house systems. So once that ascendant is calculated, then it, builds the chart. A Placidus system that I uses quadrant. That are other, such as I think Porphyry it's calculated slightly different, but it still calculates your ascendant and your midheaven, and then how it figures in the quadrants of the houses in between the four angles. And the four angles are the first house and the seventh and the fourth and the 10th. And so that's important to understand, in that there's quadrant houses. There's things like also the equal houses. So once you get the ascendant, then they can do a calculation, some figure out the ascendant, and that will calculate then the rest of the chart in terms of, say, equal house systems. So that's valuable to know in your basics when you're getting started. Now, we'll go into a whole other video about house systems, but the ascendant is basically an essential point that helps set up the houses, okay? And so those having to create a chart by hand, I have not done this myself. I'm going to be honest. I have used software from the beginning. I wanted to understand why certain things were archetypally and the planets in play more. That was more important to me when I first started. What planets were acting and like what was happening between the relationship between the planets and life experience. That was something I was most interested in the beginning. You may have something that you're most interested in as well when you deep dive into astrology and as you get started. So it's like you kind of like have to start off with a bunch of questions, kind of like the Gemini part of learning. You have to ask a bunch of questions, and that kind of helps guide what you're going to learn. And many of you have asked, for 101 videos on the ascendant. So I will try to do more than one video to help understand. But this is, I think, some of the basics that will help get you started in understanding that, how important it is and why. But again, I can appreciate technology because it helps me be an astrologer. If I had to do charts by hand, I don't think I could be where I am today. I think I would have still done a lot with astrology and powered through calculating by hand, but I think the volume that I have moved through a variety and volume of charts is only because I have software to do that. So thank goodness for tech. Okay, so in closing, I just wanted to show a chart. I circled the ascendant. We can see Jane Goodall and her ascendant at 6 degrees and 15 minutes of Sagittarius, and that kind of gives you the shape of her chart, and you can see that first house, that ascendant starts that first house in Sagittarius rising. So Sag rising. This is a tropical Placidus chart, and that sets the first house and seventh house. So you have your first house and your seventh house. So those are two angles. And then you have the midheaven that comes from that calculation by place of birth, and then the place and time of birth, right? And that sets up the 10th house and the fourth house. And we'll get into reading Jane's chart in another video, but I think it's valuable just to kind of point out the ascendant in her chart, and that you can see how it displays the planets around the wheel and through a variety of houses in the Placidus. Now, if you were looking at a whole sign, things would shift slightly to show each house as one sign. So again, I like to use whole sign once in a while, but you'll see some astrologers, that's what they use exclusively. I tend to be a little bit more fluid in what I use for what purpose. And I think that's valuable. It depends on the discipline of astrology that you're working with. So I hope this video has been helpful for you in exploring details about the ascendant and what the word horoscope brings in understanding that as a value of importance. And also that from an evolutionary astrologer standpoint, it is one of the three in the primal triad. So you have the sun, the moon, and the ascendant, the rising sign. And this is going to be a foundational piece to understanding the ascendant. So thank you so much for joining me today on this 101 astrology point of view. Thank you for joining me today on the ascendant. It's a very important foundational calculation and degree, and it gives the individual the understanding of so many other parts of the chart because it sets up the houses. It also is, let's go back to, with Jane's chart, you can see that she's a Sag rising, and a Sagittarius rising at 6 degrees and 15 minutes. Now, we also see her moon is right above in degree. So we know that will have an arcing in time down to her ascendant. That's maybe a future subject about what are solar arcs. But having the moon on the ascendant like that, it kind of emphasizes themes of the moon, which are related to when it's in a fire sign, is very outwardly expressed and kind of a bit of the adventure, the professor, the teacher. But it also is Sagittarius's belief and a direct communicator. And then it helps you understand a little bit like what planets can be on the ascendant. It kind of is a part of the identity, right? So because that ascendant is the first house of identity. It is the angle, and then the angle, there's a phrase I've used often is so many things happen on the angles of life that you understand the cross of life. And when you understand the cross of life, you have such a huge perspective of the importance of the angles, but especially the ascendant, and especially the planet that is the ruler, responsible for, or the affinity, basically what's responsible for Sagittarius when we're looking at it, and that would be Jupiter. So in Jane's chart, she has her Jupiter in Libra. Jupiter was retrograde when she was born. So these are very important clues to Jane's life. The position of her Jupiter's in the 10th house, very public personality, right? She's going to be it basically puts her in a very visible place. And I would imagine when we get into studying Jane Goodall's chart, we'd have to look at the timing of Jupiter from her time of, her day of birth. It was retrograde. How many days after her birth did that Jupiter station to go from retrograde to a direct movement? That would be a very key month, year in Jane's life. And so that's something that is a more of an advanced topic. But I think when beginners start looking at a chart of astrology and understanding the importance of the ascendant, the degree of the ascendant, the ruling planet of the ascendant, it can help frame so much context and themes that will carry into the life story. So that is important to understand. It's like, is that ruling planet of the ascendant visible to the ascendant, or is it in a sign that's just after, or excuse me, just before or just after? Because those are kind of like what we would call in the blind spot bit. So the individual who is born with that position, with the ruling planet behind or right in the say in the 12th house or in the beginning part. But if you're in 3 degrees of the ascendant, it's really like the whole planet is kind of focused on the identity, right? So it kind of depends on the degree how close it is to the ascendant. But again, the ascendant is important, but also the ruling planet. And that kind of sets up understanding its relationship to other planets and how these aspects, and we'll go into aspects in another chart. But I think to begin exploring the ascendant is to go to astro.com or astro/seek.com, have a few individuals in mind that you'd like to look at, and just look at their ascendant. What is their rising sign? What is the degree on the ascendant? And really, with a notebook, making notes, just the basics. What's their ascendant? What's the degree? What's the degree of the ascendant and the sign in terms of what that is, the rising sign? Are there any planets sitting right on it, above or below, but right on it within 3 degrees, right? Take note of that. And then what's that sign? And then understanding there is a planet that is responsible for that essence of that sign in terms of how it communicates some kind of activity as a human being, right? So Jupiter is about expansion. And so we're looking at what might be expanded, but you're coupling that with there's an archetype that might be Sagittarius. An archetype is kind of like the teacher, right? Sagittarius, like the teacher, the professor, the philosopher, or the foreigner. That's Sagittarius. And it's a little bit wild, right? So Sagittarius is also the element is fire, and that's a mutable sign. So Sagittarius is a mutable sign. And so the individual every sign around the zodiac has a mode of how it operates. It's either cardinal, fixed, or mutable. Now, again, that'll be another lesson of 101, but that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the ascendant. We're looking at the sign. When we have an accurate time of birth, it will give us a degree in a minute. And for Jane Goodall, it's 6 degrees of Sagittarius and 15 minutes of arc at that moment, where what was rising at that moment of her birth from the location on planet Earth that she was born. And then, knowing that, we have Jupiter, the planet that's responsible for Sagittarius in how it's positioned and visible, highly visible at the top of the chart, which it is in the 10th house, gives us more information, you see. So the ascendant and degree and a planet sitting on the ascendant. And then we have to also explore the planet that's ruling the ascendant. Now, of course, these are subjects of future 101 astrology perspectives. Of course, Astrology 101 subject material will be about the modes of the sign. So understanding the modes, which is cardinal, fixed, and mutable. This is important. And when you get into studying the aspects or learning about aspects, you'll greatly appreciate having figured out what the elements are and the modes, because it'll be easy to understand how things behave by observation, right? And then how you can language and understand that. Jupiter for Jane Goodall is the key planet for her rising sign, right? So we're always paying attention to what is responsible for giving shape to how she expresses her identity, right? That's what first house is about. It's just her, and it's how she expresses or how the world will see her. That's the mask that she wears in public life or in her life. Like that is a planet that speaks to her own way of identifying herself and how maybe understanding how others might see her or not see her, right? So that's important. So Jupiter in the 10th house, we can see just by the lines that it is trine to the Saturn and Venus down here. And of course, this is a future subject of aspects, what I just spoke of, trine. But you can see that many planets in her chart, Sun and Mars, opposite her Jupiter, Jupiter squared to Pluto in Cancer, are really saying so much about her ruling planet. And her ruling planet is kind of the thing that drives her and activates her in her public persona and profession, her reputation. That's for our lesson on houses, what they represent. Her ruling planet is in the 10th house. It has a lot going on with it, right? So again, just as we finalize our review of this, is the ascendant gives a frame for the context of the rest of the calculation of the houses of whatever house system someone uses. I'm using Placidus, and I'm using the tropical zodiac. So I look at things from the seasonal perspective of astrology, not sidereal. Sidereal is more accurate to what is actually in the heavens at 20, through the band of 23 degrees and a half or something like that, for their calculation. Tropical takes it from a seasonal perspective of looking at it. So that's very important. It kind of gives a perspective that I think is more, this could be a philosophy thing, but it's kind of like in the context of how we register ourselves through seasons of life versus, by the minute and the hour and the backdrop like that. So, and there's been some other things, I think, in recent, maybe in the recent months, in videos and sharing about the calculation of our perspective from Earth. And so that's a whole long conversation, something for a live, about the different perspectives. But I just want to kind of give you this from the standpoint of, if you're to start off, ground zero, learning about how a chart comes together and the importance of the ascendant. You have to understand it is the moment of the hour, the minute. That's what's rising in the east in terms of that moment to calculate the ascendant. And that gives then the ability to calculate the rest of the chart based on your location, and it helps you give the midheaven. And there's, I can go into the midheaven also in another video, but I want to help you understand it's kind of the hour and the moment of what was rising at the time of birth. And where you are on Earth gives you kind of some degree of perspective on that, right? Now, if you're really far north or really, really far south, Placidus chart might not work. You might want to look at another chart like equal houses, or maybe whole sign house is a better perspective when you are, say, significantly far north, say above in like the northern parts of Scandinavian countries, or at the very bottom of South America or something like that. And what if you're born at the southern tips of those continents? I think it's important to kind of keep that as a perspective of what is going to be a better house system for where I'm looking at. And you can still read the astrology. It just kind of gives you a different perspective of how the calculation is in the houses in like these are the first house and the second, more like the second and the third house calculations. So the houses in between the angles is what I mean to say. So I think that's important as a student. It depends on where you're located, what house system you might adopt in the beginning. I hope in understanding the ascendant, you understand the importance of the cross of life when looking at astrology and your chart. Having a new awareness now that the ascendant is so important because of the accuracy it gives us in the splay of the planets across the chart, and what houses those will end up in when they have the accurate time of birth. That helps us understand you, because the ascendant is a symbolic representation of you. It's like a mirror of you out into the world, like your mask of identity out into the world. But it's also the ruling planet of your ascendant that's so important, because it gives another layer of understanding how you embody and give shape to your identity, in what context is your consciousness focused on. I think it's important to understand those elements of what goes into the ascendant, and thank goodness that we have technology nowadays to actually calculate the charts for us. We have astro.com and astroseek.com as two free softwares that you can use to do that. And I'm curious, is this the first time you're calculating your chart or looking into what does your ascendant mean, and why is it so important when I'm looking at astrology in relationship maybe to the sun sign or even your moon sign? We can go into moon signs as well soon. But I think this is valuable for those who are very new to astrology and curious about, why is it so important? Why should I care about what my rising sign is? I thought I was, such and such sun sign. And hopefully this gives you some context to why it is important. And the speed of something in the calculation for the planets or the chart in terms of the ascendant is so, so important in astrology. Speed. So anyway, I hope you've had a fun time looking at the subject, and thank you so much for sharing this video. If you've got a friend that you think would enjoy this as well, please share. And until next time, I look forward to hearing from you on the poll when I look at other subjects that we'll explore and which one you prioritize. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week. Bye now.